Hiring the wrong executive costs you time and money. Leveraging work psychology, Spirit Consulting helps you hire the right executive so you can focus on growing your business. For a free quote, visit spiritmco.com. Enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Tips for Team Building podcast, where our mission is to inspire and propel others along in their leadership journeys. So excited to connect with our guest today, Angela Bishop. Angela, thank you so much for taking the time today. And for those who don't know you, always like to start off the show with, who are you?
Thanks, Jaden, for the introduction. My name is Angela Bishop, and new in my position at Ronald McDonald House, charity of Western Washington and Alaska. I am a native Montana, so if there's any Montana folks, my first 30 years were there, and I've been in Washington for the last couple of decades. Mom of 4 teenage daughters, so a little bit busy, and I've been in nonprofit probably for about 10 years, but my original career trajectory started out as a high school history teacher. And when I was working in Montana, I also worked for 10 years as a backcountry wilderness ranger for the Forest Service. So a couple of different careers that led me into my current role.
I love it. I love it. Such a diverse experience. And wow, four teenage daughters. You definitely have your hands full. I have a sister who's turning 17 in July. So can definitely could definitely relate to just having one teenage sibling in the household,
Yeah.
Versus 4. That's just kudos to you. How do you do it?
Lots of energy. There's a lot of energy, and I get out of the house a lot, and I also find my quiet space in the house with the book. So,
Awesome. So, Angela, you kind of gave us a rundown and kind of the various roles that you've held and the new role that you're in at the Ronald McDonald House of Western Washington and Alaska. Can you just kind of give us a little bit more insight into how you've gotten into the leadership position you're in today?
sure. It's a bit of a winding path, as I think it is for a lot of folks. When I was, growing up, I didn't say when I grow up, I want to be an executive director of a nonprofit. It's interesting. I would have to say I'll go back to my career as a high school teacher is really where I think I honed my leadership style. And I say that because I taught sophomores, juniors, and seniors. Had 150 students. And I'll tell you what, they definitely know when you're not prepared. They will call you out. There's no cubicle to go hide into if you're having a bad day. So what I learned, I think, from and I was a teacher for 8 years, and I have the utmost admiration for teachers. It is truly a really rewarding and challenging job. I would say what I learned from that, though, my students taught me, and I always said, I hoped that I was the greatest student in the class because I really learned so much, was really the importance of being genuine and transparent. Because speaking to teenagers, nobody calls you out like a teenager, and they can sense, if you're being disingenuous, they can catch it right away. If you weren't prepared, you don't show up as your true self. They'll call you out on that. And so I really have my students to thank for, I think, sculpting that and really making me a better leader for who I am today. And, I think a lot of folks don't equate teachers as leaders, but I see that, a lot. And I was able to, hopefully I was able to take the best characteristics of that and transfer it to my current role.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I remember, with us talking previously, that one of kind of the drivers for you to get out of education and want to make a bigger impact in the nonprofit world was Columbine and the events there. And I think that you're seeing, with some of the recent school shootings and such as well, you're seeing a lot of teachers who are making that move out of the teaching profession. So I think it's important to highlight how those skills are transferable, because not everyone sees that, but definitely they definitely are.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Teaching was my hardest job, and it really, I don't want teachers to leave the profession by any means, but it's an incredible skill set for sure that can be transferred to a lot of other professions.
Yeah, absolutely. So Angela, you are, leading an organization that's, $4 to $5 million, very large, making a big impact. You're the executive leader for a team of 30 plus individuals. And that's no small feat. So kudos to you first. But then, the question I have from there is like, what is your approach to building relationships as a leader?
That's a great question. Uh, well, I will speak to my most recent experience and the job that I'm in now. I started in late February. Now we're going into June. So my first 30 days. So one of the things I did was I did buy the book, The First 90 Days, and I can't remember the name of the author, but I'm sure folks know. And not to give a plug because he's doing well on his book sales, but I did use that as my guide. Um, and one of the things that he advises is to meet one-on-one with everybody. Obviously with your direct reports. I think he said with your direct reports, but I really went beyond that, and I tried to meet one-on-one with all 30 staff. And it took me a couple of months to do that. So setting up 1 hour meetings with them, and just really it was information gathering, and there were some questions that I lifted from that book. One of the questions was, what are some opportunities that you see? What are some changes you would like to see? What are current strengths? And it was really interesting, and I gathered all of that information, took a lot of notes from director level, senior managers, all the way down to folks who are really doing the hard work on the front line. And it was interesting in that process. Some of the staff would come up and say, I didn't even know where the executive director's office was. So, just really breaking down some of those barriers, those silos, was one of the first steps. And so I think, and also the first step in trust building, and really, I think out of that information gathering was also an opportunity to understand the culture. And obviously what's been successful up to that point, what are some challenges and opportunities that they see. And then I've compiled all of that information and kind of disseminated it into, some patterns or trends or themes that we can then take and determine, where do we want to go from here now that we have this information. And I share that out with the staff in a very general way so that people can't identify. But because you want to be able to, that was the other thing, is that you want to build that trust. So making sure folks know in these conversations that we're having, that that they feel safe, and that they feel like they can share information. And I really approached that relationship building piece. I think what was helpful for me is, yes, I'm the executive director, but I'm such an outsider. I use that as my advantage. And what I mean by that is I can come in as a consultant almost. So I kind of put on a consultant hat. And that's when, whatever they say, it doesn't, they can say the positive, the negative, the good, the bad, the ugly, because I'm new here and I'm truly just trying to understand. And so I think that lifted things a little bit, so that they felt a little bit more open to share. So and I got a lot of good feedback from staff. They were saying, I hear you're talking, you're meeting with folks. That's huge. And including not only the staff, but I also identified some longstanding volunteers that had been with the organization for years, and met with them as well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And yeah, to not further plug the book, I won't, mention that it's on my desk right next to me as well, because it's a book that I read, coming into my new role as well.
Yeah.
So he's whoever that author is, I'm not sure off the top of my head, but definitely making an impact in
Yes.
that way.
Yes.
But so Angela, coming into a new organization, especially like, as a, I've I've had experiences, coming in as like a manager or a leader within an organization, but never as like the top dog, right? And like that's kind of the role that you've assumed at the Ronald McDonald House. And I'm sure that there are just some differences in terms of like culture, or in terms of like we spoke to relationships or just processes and the way things are done. Can you kind of talk through like how you're able to adapt to a culture when entering a new position, and what are some of the specific challenges that are faced when doing so?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question. Um, well, I would say coming into this, it does help that I'm wearing, I wore that consultant hat for the first, 3 months, if you will. I stepped into a role for my predecessor had been here for 17 years. So there were definitely systems in place. And there's a bit of transition for sure as staff are trying to figure you out, what's she like, what are her boundaries, and you're trying to figure them out as well. And I would say, and this kind of goes along with change, is just being mindful that, they hired you for a reason. So I'm kind of being mindful of what that was, and being true to yourself that this is my leadership style, this is my approach. And then once it will inevitably bump up against the culture. And so then it's like, oh, there's that hard spot, there's that boundary. And then thinking that through. So how much do I want to push through that? Or do I want to just kind of come back and pause, and we'll revisit that when the time is right. So I don't have any magic formula. It's really, it's intuitive in some ways. There's emotional intelligence involved, and I'm at an age where I think I've learned a bit of what works and doesn't work. I definitely, when I was younger, I'd be like, yes, we're going to make change yesterday, and no patience, and obviously learning the hard way what that didn't work. So I think, and in the reading, several different leadership books, and I would say what resonates with me is really understanding what people's capacity for change is. And so just being, are they ready for that? They're not quite ready for that. And it could be on an individual basis. It could be by team, by department, and by organization wide. And for those of us who report to a board, so probably most folks would agree with this, that change happens from within, and then you got to kind of catch the board up. So I'm definitely experiencing that. So I think just being mindful of what everybody's capacity is, but also I think your job as the leader is to push that envelope. So you do kind of have to be that hard edge that, yes, I understand concerns and anxiety, and we're going to work through that. The other piece I would say, and I want to focus more on culture because I know that was the question, is what do you want from that? What do you want to keep from that culture? Because obviously they've been doing some great work. You love the mission. What resonates with you? What do you want to make sure that you continue on? And because that means a lot to folks, those traditions, and understanding what their values are. I will say this, in my current role, there's actually not there are no adopted values or a vision. So that is something that we get to undertake this year as a board and staff. But there are those inherent values that they have, and they do it. And so I've been writing those down. Those words come up in conversation: hospitality, compassion, nourishment. I'm like, okay, those are pieces that are really important to the staff. So also, I think as you're trying to figure out what the culture is, I take a lot of notes, and when those words pop up, I definitely write those down and then come back. Tell me more what you meant by that when you said that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you hit on a couple things that, kind of wanting to follow up on. I mean, first, just the EQ. I think it's so, and like just knowing, like adapting to, because that was really the question, is how do you adapt to a new culture, not how do you implement your culture, or how do you
Right.
like do
Yeah.
this, but how do you kind of like, intertwine the two. And I think that, having that emotional intelligence, like it's easy to be like, you didn't get into the role that you're in today by just being like complacent and, just sitting around. So like you have a lot of ambition and drive and things that you like want to happen, but just being able to kind of like recognize which ones of those are like high priority and which ones of those can we kind of like take a step back and kind of hold on until you've established that trust and that credibility, in terms of the high priority items that you're pushing forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Trust and credibility. I totally agree with you on that. Those are very important.
Yeah. Awesome. And I think that, so you mentioned as well, just being able to look at various leadership books and like organizational leadership books. One that I would recommend if you haven't read it yet, especially with kind of where you all are at and like casting the vision or casting the values. A book that we read here at Spirit is called Traction, and
Oh,
they
interesting.
use and there's a little bit more of a title to it, so I can send that out. But it's by Gino Wickman, and it's called the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And for us being like a smaller company and kind of like establishing those things, it's really kind of meant for like those entrepreneurs, but it's also meant for like being able, and is can be used at large organizations. And it's all like kind of getting to the basics of like, what is your mission? What are your values? What are, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And it kind of creates like this system of like, okay, these are the meetings that need to be had regularly. This is what you cover
Mhm.
in those meetings. And basically like just breaking down, okay, like our vision is our 10-year goal. Now we break that into a 3-year goal. Now we break that into a 1-year goal. Now we break that into like quarterly goals. And it just kind of helps you like stay laser focused on where you're
Yeah.
wanting to go and kind of establish like, controls for in ensuring that the people that you're hiring and you're working with are like upholding the values that have been established. So it's a really great, just kind of like manual in terms of like how to establish those things and then how to like hold yourself accountable for them, because it's so easy to say like, oh yeah, these are our values or this is our vision, and then to get like stuck in the day to day, right? Or to get stuck in kind of the 6 months. But it really kind of helps you like keep that vision front of mind in everything that you do.
Love that. Yeah, especially using values as, mentioning it, breaking it down by the 10-year to 5-year to 3-year, quarterly, monthly. I and that's one of the things I'm telling, when I talk to staff and they're really excited about going through that process, because so much of what we decide, we lean on our values. And so, and we, as we should. And I keep, talking about how our budget is a reflection of our values. So what do we value? What's prioritized in the budget? And so I really look forward to going through that process, and I will look into that book because that sounds like a good guidebook for us trying to figure out. This organization will be celebrating 40 years next year, and they've been doing incredible work for 40 years. Who are we, and where do we want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So another book that you had mentioned in preparation was the book Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. So wanting to kind of hear, you wanted to bring this up. So just want to hear like why this was such a meaningful book for you, and why do you recommend it to our audience?
Yeah, it's interesting. I would not recommend saying that you're an introvert when you are applying for a job. I had that backfire on me once, but that's why I love this book, is because it really speaks to, we live in the American culture just celebrates and elevates extroverts, and I have nothing against extroverts. I love them. We need them in our lives, but for us introverts, I think it's a little bit challenging to navigate interviews and leadership, because so much of leadership and especially in American culture, is about that extrovert. And this book really resonated with me because she talks about how introverts have these really unique leadership qualities that tend to not be as emphasized in extroverts, and in fact either complement extroverts or they excel in certain areas where extroverts are a little bit more challenged. And so I identify as an introvert. And what I mean by that is I can lead an organization all day, but I'll tell you what, at the end of the day, I'm exhausted. And I get my energy from going home and reading a book, listening to podcasts, paint by number, whatever, but I need my alone time to re-energize, and then I'm good to go again. And I think there's a lot of pieces in this book that she gives examples through, I think she talks about the cult of personality, and how I really appreciate the historical, how she talks about that, and through the decades. And I don't know, I think for me, it really resonated, especially as a woman, because so much of what it is expected of a leader are definitely probably attributes that you would identify more with a masculine leadership style approach, and it's valued more. So I think, and again, I'm speaking as a woman, I think women, or myself, I've tried to fit into that mold of what is expected as a leader, but you also have to be careful not to be too much of a leader in that style as a woman. And this one just kind of allows, I think this book really allows that introvert to be natural in your style, and that those attributes can actually lead a very strong organization. And she highlights some Fortune 500 companies that have been led by introverts, and then compares with extrovert leaders as well. And again, not diminishing the strengths of extroverts, we definitely need them, but I think again, it's the first book that I came across where it speaks specifically to an introvert and how they can really provide a lot of those skill sets that you normally wouldn't see in an extroverted leader.
Have you been feeling unfulfilled? You want to be happy, but just continue to struggle. One of the best ways to experience joy is by caring for the homeless. A charity I've grown to love, River of Light, food rescues 1 million meals per year for the needy in Chicago. Imagine how that makes you feel, knowing that you're helping feed children and veterans. To make a tax-deductible donation, visit riveroflightchicago.org. Again, riveroflightchicago.org. No one should go to bed hungry.
Yeah, I love it. And how great of us to be, breaking the stereotype of two introverts on a podcast together.
Yeah, look at us.
So let's go, Angela.
Good job, us.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And definitely like also here of like, it's even more challenging. And obviously I can't relate to the piece about being a woman in leadership, but have just like talked to so many people and heard of like it's really like so difficult to like find that balance, because like you said, if you're like trying to like fit in with that like super hyper aggressive extroverted like masculine type leadership style, then you're just a jerk, and you're just like super like everyone like is like, oh my gosh, this person. But then like if you are more reserved in that way, then it's like, okay, like you're not assertive enough and you're not doing that. So could definitely like just appreciate you sharing that as just like another perspective of not just like introverted, being an introvert and being a leader, but being a woman leader and an introvert. And like, kind of how like you've had to like overcome some biases or stereotypes to like get to the position that you are. So super, meaningful there, and just appreciate that. So Angela, just wanting to kind of, and thinking about, we talked about like, how you build relationships with staff and how we kind of like build like culture and commitment to the organization. In the nonprofit world, it's no secret that the jobs aren't, as high paying, as some of the for-profit positions. And, it means that like historically you're seeing a lot less of like a talent pool for, people who like make a career out of this. I mean, you said yourself, like I didn't, dream about this growing up. Like it just kind of happened, right? So you see people like, making careers more in the for-profit sector than, the not-for-profit. So, wanting to kind of hear, like, knowing that there is that shortage of like dedicated professionals in the area, and there are so many nonprofits that are, providing such great services. What do you like? What is your secret, and what do you consider to be most important in retaining staff?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, I would first of all say I'm learning on that topic, especially now in this economy with inflation. And I'm in King County, Washington, which is one of the most expensive places to live. Our cost of living is pretty horrendous, and so it is hard. Especially we live in a more affluent part of Seattle. And so our organization is based there. And so it is tough when you've got staff that are commuting, a good hour and a half away because that's where they can afford to live. And that is something that, every nonprofit in this area is having to, we've been having to for the last 10 years trying to figure this one out. I think to your point, compensation is important. Obviously, having what we call a living wage. So taking into consideration, 30% of your income goes to a mortgage or rent. So you need to be making at least that. So that's kind of what they're basing it on, and the number of people in your household. So we've been looking at those surveys of wages in King County and trying to be competitive in our industry. Obviously, we can't compete with Amazon, which is also here, and Google and Salesforce and all of those other organizations. But people are gravitate to this profession for a reason, as you mentioned, not so much for the compensation, but at the end of the day, it is nice to be compensated. So
Right.
looking at what can we do to be competitive and provide that living wage. And that's kind of where I was talking about your budget is a reflection of your values. So making sure that we are paying all of our staff a living wage. So not just admin leadership, but also all to our frontline staff, our facilities and maintenance, and making sure that we're being competitive with that. So with that in mind, I think that's part of it. And then having opportunities from growth within. So how do you make sure that people can do this in your organization? So is there more management lead positions that they can take? So if they go from, case manager 1 to case manager 2, case manager 3, building that upward growth within the organization and providing the coaching and the professional development that goes with that. I found that that's huge. And then I think the other piece that people especially are craving, and I've always craved, but it seems like it's more needed now more than ever, as we just seem to be living in a more fragmented, world with social media and just an overabundance of too much is connection. And so, and with COVID, I know that's been hard too. So how do you provide that connection among your staff? I will say, as I said, I'm learning. I was just listening to a podcast. Again, she doesn't need a plug, but Brene Brown on her Dare to Lead, one of her podcasts, and it's talking about toxic culture. And that's a pretty meaty podcast, that particular session, and I've been taking notes on it. But it was interesting. One of the things that they say in order not to have kind of the anecdote to toxic culture is just the simple team building, social gatherings. I mean, we're just craving that. It's just something as simple as we're going to provide lunch today. Come meet us, outside on the patio. And so I find that that's been a huge piece. And then the other piece that I have learned from my one-on-one interviews is just really wanting to be valued and recognized for the work that they do, whether it's cleaning the floors of our facilities to I just secured, a $5,000 check from a donor, whatever that recognition can look like, something as simple as that. So I've been trying to include that in my what I've been doing lately is doing an I call it executive director update. So it goes out once a week, which is, it's a bit of work for me, but it's important right now because we're going through so much change. And I do those recognition in those email updates. So kind of shout outs, and then infusing that throughout the organization. So it's not just me doing the shout out, I'm modeling that behavior, but that we also have opportunities for staff to do the shout outs of their peers and their colleagues.
I love that. I love that. And so much, so like many directions that we could go from there. I think that, in the interest of keeping us on time, we won't probably dive too deep, but I do think that, as mentioned earlier, the book Traction, one of the things that they, recommend is like they do, weekly meetings, with like the leadership team, and then like, each team, so let's say like operations or development, finance, whatever it may be, each team has a weekly meeting, and starting out each of those meetings with what they call a segue, which is just sharing like the best business and personal news that you've had in the last week.
I like that.
And
Yeah.
it's just another way to, like you said, with connection, is like it's so easy to just like get stuck and like, you jump in a meeting, now we're talking business, or like we're just such, we're in a grind, in your all's case, like, beds are full, and we need to figure this out, or we're on a tight, deadline to get this many donations. Like it's so easy to just get like stuck in the work. But just being able to like create that connection, and like having a piece of your meeting like chunked out to be able to do so is just something that we found very, very beneficial.
That's a great idea. Well, I think we'll do that at our next staff meeting. Segue. I like
I
it.
love it. I love it. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Angela, when kind of talking about like the change in the culture management, is like that the changes happen within, and then you have to kind of like catch the board up, right? So you're in a unique position of like, we could talk about like how you manage and hold your team accountable and lead them to victories, but in a unique position where you're the top executive for the organization. So just kind of curious if you could share how you approach managing the performance and expectations of your bosses, aka the board of directors.
Yeah. Oh, the board ED relationship. It's so interesting. um, this will be, I think, board number 5 that I've worked with. And I will say just nonprofit governance in itself is challenging. It's very imperfect. So I think walking into it knowing it's imperfect, but it's the best thing that we have so far. I know there's some interesting research going on out there with some experimenting on what nonprofit governance could look like without a board, but we're still far away from that. But in the meantime, I think there's a lot of great resources out there on how to manage and partner with the board, but you are truly doing both. And I would say that the best success that I've had with the board, it really depends. It's all dependent on having that strong relationship with your board chair. If you don't have that, it's really hard to get any traction, to get anywhere. So I think building that trust and that relationship from the get-go is hugely important. And I invest a lot of time in that. And I know sometimes it can be really challenging. Inevitably, your board chair is, this is one of many things that they are doing. And so trying to grab that coffee time. But I think once you've got that established and saying, really saying it's a bit of a dance. And so really coming together and saying that we're partnering with each other, and I've got your back, you've got mine, this is how we want to approach. That's been really helpful. And I would say my current role, my board chair is really excited about improving our board engagement. And how do we get the board more involved and engaged, which I know is an ongoing issue with a lot of nonprofit boards, is making sure that you've got really busy they're community volunteers and they're very, very busy. So how do you get them to care about what you're doing? Yes, they care, but how do you get them to also invest that time and their talent? And so I think part of that is, and we just had a board meeting last night, and they got a flavor, they got a sense of what my leadership style was, and it's very, very different from my predecessor. So it'll be interesting. But I just wanted to tell folks out there, it's okay through these leadership transitions. This inevitably happens. You might have some board members that are like, great, thanks, but no thanks. I didn't really sign up for this. And that's okay. And so I think some board turnover when you have a change of turnover, or you have a new leadership at the executive level, is very normal. Because when the dust settles, you've got your core group, and then you have opportunity to recruit and build that board as well. But having said that, so I'm looking at my board right now and figuring out where do we want to go, and working with our executive committee. They definitely want more board engagement. So I think identifying what does that mean, what does that look like, and making sure that the board is accountable, that they understand what their fiduciary and governance responsibilities are, making sure that they're getting out of the weeds, out of operations, and back into their lane of governance. Because once you get them into governance, that's the fun part, is we don't need to look at looking at the finance line item, why did postage go up this month? Let's get you out of there and think about more like, where do we want to be in 2 years? Do we want to be able to serve more families, and how do we do that? Looking at our partners, if we see our partners being able to treat more families, then that means that we're going to have to grow as well. Those are the big picture items and discussions that you want on the board to have. And then making sure that the board is accountable to itself. So I think building in that self-evaluation of individual board members, and there's a lot of fantastic tools out there for that, as well as having them evaluate themselves as a board, as a body. And I think that's the other piece, is I try to remind folks, because sometimes you'll have a board member that thinks that they're your individual boss, and you have to kind of politely get them to say, as when you are on a committee and you're coming to the office and you're volunteering to do something, you are acting as a volunteer, but the board as a body is the oversight, the accountability of the organization. So sometimes those awkward conversations need to be had, but you can build that into board education and development, as well as the evaluations.
Awesome. And I think that that's so helpful for any, nonprofit leader who might be listening in, specific to board governance. But I think you also made a point of like, when you have new leadership coming into an organization, it's natural to have some turnover. And I think that that's such a fact that like just could resonate with anybody, listening in. Is like that as you enter an organization, if you lose a few people along the way, like obviously you don't want to, but some of that is like meant to be. And like just kind of recognizing that and not beating yourself up, right? Because I think it would be easy to be like, oh shoot, we lost this person and like it's all my fault. What did I do? And like having some reflection is definitely good. You don't want to think like, oh yeah, they lost out, whatever. But you also like need to recognize that some of that just comes with the transition and change of leadership, and it just promotes like an opportunity for you to be able to find someone who more aligns with where you're going and where the organization's going, collectively. So I think that that's such a good point to kind of highlight.
Yeah, absolutely. Just continuing to be genuine in your approach and who you are as a leader, and then your board will reflect that. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So Angela, if anyone in the audience today was inspired by your approach, some of the stories that you have, or would like to reach out for guidance or counsel as they're, navigating some of these, challenges themselves, how can people reach out to you?
My contact information, definitely email is the best way. I would love to connect with folks if they're interested, and learn from them as well. Do you want me to say my email?
Yeah, let's do it. Just
It's
for
a
sake of ease.
Yeah, it's Angela at rmhc seattle.org.
Awesome. And we can include that in the show notes as well. So Angela, just want to thank you so much for being a guest on this episode of the Tips for Team Building podcast, where our mission is to inspire and propel others along in their leadership journeys. I'm sure that this episode will do just that, and really enjoyed the opportunity to reconnect and look forward to continuing the dialogue with you.
Thank you, Jaden. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in to the Tips for Team Building podcast, where we propel others along in their leadership journeys. If you enjoyed the show, would you please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listened? You can also visit www.spiritmco.com to find out more about how Spirit Consulting inspires virtuous leadership. We'll see you next time.